All right, welcome to our penultimate session for education in the U.S. This week I'm talking about politics and funding in education, and the lecture I'm looking at, or I'm going to present here, it's a brief one, but it's just sort of answering the question, or trying to answer the question, does money matter to education? Seems like a pretty easy question to answer, but I hope you've gained the sense from the readings that it's a bit more complex than that. Just to remind you, this being our next to last session, your philosophies are due on our last session, and I only have 48 hours to turn grades around, so that means you need to turn them in before or on that last day of class, that last session. I can't really accept them late because I don't have enough time to turn them around and then submit your grades. This week we have our last seminar leadership and your final essential question. Okay, so let's talk about money. A lot of ed reform has come through the courts, not necessarily through Congress or through state governments. Okay, and lawsuits have argued that if all schools are to educate equally, all schools must have equal funding, right? Just from a purely constitutional standpoint. And opponents of school finance reform argue that such reforms would blunt local control of schools, right? If states or the federal government were going to equalize funding, because we are aware that schools are funded through property taxes and property values vary widely throughout the country, and therefore school funding varies widely throughout the country, that this would end up having the effect of blunting local control of schools. That America has a legacy of local control of schools, and that this type of reform would take that control away. Now, this is not the case in places like Singapore, where they have high-performing schools in centrally funded nations like Singapore. Okay, the schools still retain their local control regardless of centralized funding. The more common argument against equal funding is that just money doesn't make a difference. Urban schools, large budgets, paint a complicated picture of how money is actually used, but when some folks look at the line items of budgets of suburban school districts that are affluent and urban school districts that have a lower socioeconomic status, and say, well, the same amount of money is going to these schools, so it's clearly not money that's the problem. Though a lot of you reflected in your field experiences on the amount of money raised by the PTA, and those resources go to bettering arts programs, physical education, school uniforms, dances, and so on, these features of schools that help make well-rounded students. And then another argument is that if race and socioeconomic status are stronger predictors of success in schools, how can we expect money to actually make a difference? But studies have shown, and I won't go into all of them, but Linda Darling-Hammond demonstrates pretty soundly that if you concentrate specific resources in areas of need in schools, that can make a difference in student achievement. So let's talk about that. How does money make a difference? Well, the old argument is that, it's common sense that not all spending will improve school achievement, right? It's not a guarantee. It's not, throwing money at the problem. More recent studies from the 80s on have found that teacher training certification do actually make a difference, though, in the quality of education and the achievement of students. So teacher training clearly matters, and funds could be used towards improving resources in struggling schools. You can invest in teacher salaries to produce higher marginal gains in student achievement. You could use that to reduce class sizes. We know that's shown gains in student achievement. And teacher training and class size are two policy-controlled inputs that could be invested in, but are often not in struggling schools. Now, in struggling schools, we also know that there's a high teacher turnover rate. And the failure to retain high-quality teachers is a major cost to schools, though that cost is oftentimes not recognized. Hiring new teachers costs money, as the remediation of student achievement from years of having ineffective teachers continues on and on and on. The replacement cost for teachers who leave their careers early is between $15,000 and $20,000 per teacher. This calculation includes the cost of separation, recruitment of new faculty, hiring, training. Okay, all those things cost money. We don't really think about, when a school has to hire a new third grade teacher every 2 years. Well, those costs add up. Never mind the cost on student achievement just from not having a stable learning environment. Adding the cost of reduced learning for students experience when their teachers are replaced with novices, the costs rise to about $33,000 and $48,000 per teacher. So this cost can undo other school reforms. The study after study has demonstrated that school improvement requires teachers who are skilled enough to carry out reforms and make year after year improvements in a coherent manner on previous gains. Right? It can't be this, patchwork type reform. It needs to be organized, cohesive, and you need the same people implementing it. So investing in well-trained teachers is a minimum here. Better salaries and working conditions will maintain an effective teaching force. And quality of school leaders, the administration, to implement these changes is a must as well. All of these improvements could be amended through policy changes, suggesting that money does indeed matter. So how does this happen? How can strategic investments impact school outcomes? Well, the courts have trouble fashioning useful remedies. And as is often the case with court rulings and litigation, there's no real way to ensure that these remedies are enforced. Legislatures often resist raising taxes or revising funding formulas. That's always a hot-button issue year after year. So if this process is going to happen, through litigation, it takes decades, right? Linda Darling Hammond, for example, talked about the Briggs versus Elliott Supreme Court case, which was heard in 1949, and it was connected to Brown. Okay, the litigants in Briggs versus Elliott became absorbed into the Brown decision, or consolidated into the Brown decision. But basically, they were arguing about the same conditions that Linda Brown faced in her school. And looking today, or I should say, in 1999, those conditions remain vastly different and unequal. Okay, so 50 years later, you had the same exact conditions in the schools arguing that separate was not equal, could never be equal. And it was not until 1999, literally 50 years later, that this case was actually brought before the court. It was the grandchildren of the original students who were now testifying. And so the state of South Carolina argued that it was only required constitutionally to provide a minimally adequate education. That's how the South Carolinian Constitution defines, the educational rights of its students. It must be minimally adequate. Okay, so the state was saying, yeah, it's separate and equal, but we don't have to do any more than that. So the onus on the defendants here was that they had to, not the defendants, the litigants, was that they had to demonstrate a connection between the resources and the outcomes, that a minimally adequate education would not lead to the outcomes expected of a 20th century or soon-to-be 21st century school. So, for example, Massachusetts has made substantial gains in raising and equalizing school funding following the Hancock and Driscoll decision in 1992, which afforded greater investments in needy schools. We saw investments in student achievement in Massachusetts, and those achievements were linked to the reform in funding. Now, in 2001, there was a mild recession, so funding cuts were made and effectively reversed that decision. Now, South Carolina, returning to the Briggs versus Elliott decision, South Carolina has never attempted such reforms. And the court determined in 2005 that funding of schools in South Carolina failed to meet the state's constitutional responsibility, but no reforms were made in response to that ruling. Right? It's one thing for the court to say it; it's another thing for the states to act on it. So Linda Darling Hammond compared the impacts of funding on both states, and she found, not surprisingly, that minority status and low socioeconomic status students, those were strong predictors of variability in student performance, but also found significant overlaps in the above factors and the availability of school resources. Thus, the largest predictor of student performance was teacher training and retention. So when you factor in teacher training and class sizes, these factors become stronger predictors of student performance than that minority status or low socioeconomic status. Okay, again, this suggests that funding matters, to say nothing of the fact that there was already unequal funding there between schools of where students were going who were predominantly low socioeconomic status or minority status. So this is an ongoing struggle. The evidence is clear, at least the empirical data, meaning what we've observed in the field. The issue becomes whether governments can be held accountable for their own performance in ensuring that all students have the conditions and resources necessary to support their right to learn. So under what conditions can money matter? Well, defenders of kind of the counter-argument that money doesn't matter typically make two claims. One is that schools at the center of these litigations are incompetent and inefficient, and so to put money into those schools would be just a waste of resources. Two is that students in these schools would not benefit from the improvement since they live in a culture of poverty. Now that's the deficit model, which we talked about earlier in the semester, and it assumes those students are simply inferior or incapable. The federal court view was expressed in 2009 under the Flores versus Arizona decision, and the court found that Arizona had not provided adequate resources to support schools with high number of ELLs. And Arizona refused to comply with the court ruling, that was a state court ruling. And so the state refused to comply with that ruling and then were brought to the Supreme Court. Okay, and Arizona argued that increased funding simply did not impact student improvement. It kind of used a who's who of anti-education scholars or people who have argued against teachers' unions and public schools to demonstrate that. But they didn't actually use data from classrooms to make that argument. The Supreme Court sent the case back to trial court to determine if conditions had changed, delaying the final ruling by years. The majority decision written by Samuel Alito claimed that education research was unanimous in supporting the notion that increased funding does not increase student performance, which is completely and 100% inconsistent with the actual scholarship on funding in schools. But in New Jersey, perseverance had paid off. 9 court rulings in Jersey over 30 years sought to equalize school funding. And whenever lawsuits were brought to court, the state attempted to prevent these cases from ever going to trial, hoping to kind of wait the lawsuits out. That's part of why it takes so many years for these cases to ever see the light of day. And finally, after 3 decades, there was a major settlement reached in 1998. And by 2000, a major investment was made in quality preschool. And in 2003, an intensive instructional improvement plan was instituted in the Abbott districts, which are a traditionally struggling district. By 2007, New Jersey had sharply increased its standing on the NAEP scores and was among the most successful in closing the achievement gap. So what do we need? And what are the elements of a real remedy? Well, we need investments in quality preschool. As several of our readings have demonstrated, these interventions have to happen early. And this is tied to the credentialing and training of quality preschool teachers. We also need investments in quality pedagogy. We need curricular reforms that are coupled with significant investment in professional development and real professional development, not sort of the mandated sit through it for 8 hours and then you're done development, but development that actually connects to the needs of teachers in specific schools. Now, attempts to fix education through litigation in the legislative process are not the only attempts to reform public schools, and not the only examples of how money matters in public education. Okay, so this is big business. 2 foundations represent 25% of funds provided to reforming education. Okay, this is a fundamentally larger effort by private donors to influence the direction of American education than ever before in the history of American education. The 3 largest foundations explored here often work in concert, making their influence much more significant. Now, Diane Ravitch calls these venture philanthropies, and they make targeted investments in education. They aim for a return on their investments, though. They're not just giving money altruistically. And they're applying the principles learned in venture capitalism, choice, deregulation, competition, to education reform. The big question is this consistent with democratic education? All right? The foundations are not accountable to the voting public. They can give the money wherever they want. If these experiments fail, they have no accountability. They simply walk away. And because these foundations are philanthropic, it is rare that their purposes are scrutinized by the media. If Bill Gates is going to give, several, $1 million to exploring education, reforms and whatnot, it's kind of hard to call the guy out if those reforms are misguided or not founded in research. Diane Ravitch calls this a conspiracy of silence. So let's talk about the big three. The first is the Walton Family Foundation. I'm sure you all know Sam Walton, founder and owner of Walmart. He's given large gifts to individual charter schools as well as public advocacy groups pushing for school choice. His aim appears to be a greater privatization and choice in public schools, and there's a consistency between the Walmart business model and their emphasis in donating for advocacy and education. And some conspiracy theorists believe that this is all a ploy by Sam Walton to get fewer people into college and more people working at his stores. I don't necessarily know that that's true, but certainly something worth thinking about. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is obviously founded by Bill Gates, and they aimed at first boosting high school graduation rates. That was kind of their big aim. So they put money into the small school movement. A lot of that money went to schools in the Pacific Northwest, where Gates is from, and putting this money into this idea of small schools. So you take like a large city school, and let's say the school is 3 stories tall. You turn it into 3 separate schools, 1 on each story. Okay, it sounds like a good idea. It really does. Small schools mean more personalized relationships with teachers and so on. But these efforts largely fail, in part because they ignored the complications of putting 3 schools in 1 building and 3 administrators sharing resources, and how difficult the ordinary functions of a high school would be when those are sort of your circumstances, when you have a more complicated bureaucracy. It also, this push ignored the reality of the achievement gap, that it begins in elementary schools, and that often large high schools can offer more selection in course offerings and extracurricular activities. So most of these efforts failed. We don't see any improvement in high school graduation rate in these places. So then the foundation shifted its focus to charter schools and performance-based pay schemes for teachers. And, Bill Gates has really spread his money around. So it's become hard to find a voice in education politics that could challenge the Gates mission. Again, never mind that it's philanthropy, right, that it's philanthropic, but it's hard to challenge that when his money is in so many people's pockets. And the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation. Eli Broad made a foundation in real estate and insurance, and he's a big believer in measurement, data, and results. Okay, and so he, if he lived 100 years ago, he'd be an administrative progressive, because his big concern is with education management and administration. So his aim is to have schools run as efficiently as private enterprises. So education leaders need to be managers, not educators, acting with incentives and punishments in mind. That's sort of the central focus there. So he's invested in political advocacy, charters, and alternate teacher training programs, rather than donating grants and fellowships like the Walton Family Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has. In particular, 3 superintendents of Oakland, California schools were graduates of the Broad Superintendent Academy. So what are the impacts here? Well, the above foundations have received broad support from politicians. Okay, Obama has supported charters and other pushes emphasized by the above foundations. Arne Duncan, Obama's Secretary of Education, is an educational manager like those promoted by Broad and benefited from Broad and Gates investments while CEO of Chicago Public Schools. So like I said, it's hard to find an area of ed politics that hasn't been touched by these folks. A result of that is this Race to the Top program. Okay, it's a $4.3 billion government education investment. It's a fund run by educational entrepreneurs like Joanne Weiss, who was a graduate of one of Broad's superintendent academies. For a state to be eligible for Race to the Top funds, it must not have a limit on charters, it must not forbid linking teacher evaluations to teacher pay, among other requirements. The 19 reforms that the state must adhere to win Race to the Prize money are essentially pulled from the mission statements of those three foundations. And so the question becomes, and this is a big piece that I read a lot in your field experiences, is the relevance of the neighborhood public schools. Right? Charter school reform chokes the ability of traditional public schools while not producing measurable gains themselves, at least not in the data we have so far. But the public school has been an essential element the neighborhood school has been an essential element of public schooling in our multicultural democracy. And education should not be a marketplace as much as entrepreneurs want it to be. Right? The market undermines the creation of a form of community consensus. Okay, so education reformers have long argued about the best ways to spend money on educating the younger generation. Of course, the arguments made by Darling Hammond and Ravitch won't end this discussion. One policy solution for the dilemma of disparities in the quality of schools is that of school choice, namely charter schools, but that's the focus of your seminar leadership. And we also have our final essential question, and your philosophies are due this week, so make sure you get all those to me in a timely manner.